And now we are about to go live on Facebook, so stand by as we get ready for another edition of course, dealing with the history of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I am Cedric Bailey, and we're about to go live on that Facebook page right now. So I'm just waiting on it to tell me that we are up, and then we're going to turn it over to our own Dr. Dorscine's Spigner Little, and we're going to hear from her and talk about what happened in Midwest City on last week and a whole lot more. So we're about ready to go ahead and do that at this time. And Dr. Littles, you are up. Let's welcome Dr. Littles on this evening, everyone.
Well,
You should.
hi to Terry. I see he came in.
Okay. Thank you. I'm very, very happy to see Eleanor join us.
Thank you.
And I've been wanting to see her in person for a long time, but this is as good to get her insight from all of the genealogical research that she has done in the past. And so she probably knows more about our ancestry. Well, Terry, I'm sorry, Terry, I didn't mean to ignore you. You are an expert on genealogical research also. But to recap from the previous two recordings or meetings we've had on podcasts, the first meeting, we were just having kind of a get together and sharing our memories about life in Carter County, because we say Ardmore, but Ardmore is comprised of a lot of people from the surrounding communities. And so they have ancestry in those communities like Milo, Berwyn, Spigner, Cheek, and so on and so forth. And so we all have a common ancestry if we have relatives that were part of the Chickasaw Nation or Choctaw Nation or whatever. So last week we were talking about the things that made Ardmore special, that we carry with us in our genes, in our memory, and so forth. That was the first meeting. The second meeting, we talked about, we were supposed to talk about two noteworthy individuals that have sort of put Ardmore on the map. And those two individuals are Mrs. Mayzola McCurson, who had the fabulous gourmet restaurant, but she was also a politician that made a mark on the world. She was the first woman to be mayor of a city of more than 30,000 people. And that was incredible. And she also was a servant. She served her community well. And the second person that we highlighted was Mrs. Gloria Ainsworth. And Mrs. Ainsworth worked in Berwyn as well as in Ardmore. Mrs. Ainsworth was a person that spoke her mind, whether she hurt your feelings or not. But beneath all of that, you could feel the love that she had. One of my aunts that lived in Tatum's, I think Mrs. Ainsworth taught in Tatum's school district. And so she and my oldest aunt had a close relationship. And when desegregation came about, they asked Miss Ainsworth to teach in the Berwyn School District. And so everybody thought that, oh, integration is on the way, this is gonna work. And so my aunt went to the school where she was to greet her and see how she was doing and just being a friend, checking up on her. And to her surprise, when she got to the school, Miss Ainsworth was teaching only Black kids. They had put all of the kids from grade 1 to grade 8 or whatever grade, all of those kids were in Miss Ainsworth's class. So she was very shocked about that because she thought that Miss Ainsworth was teaching whatever grade level she was supposed to teach, and it was mixed race class. So even though we desegregated relatively early in Carter County, there was still some underlying issues. And so tonight, with your permission, I thought we would talk about some of the past topics that we've talked about. And also we will look at a couple of questions, and you can speak on any of these questions that you want to, or we can just have a general conversation. But the topic, as you know, is reminiscence, values taught, lessons learned, and traditions to keep. Keep passing on values and lessons and traditions. So one of the questions I thought we would talk about is, does the African-American community in Ardmore have shared cultural values these days, as opposed to how our cultural values were shaped in the past? And so first of all, we'll have to define what are some of the shared values that was passed on to us when we were youthful, and who passed them on to us? Did the church pass them on to us? Did our parents pass them on to us? Was it some like a community norm that we just kind of absorbed in our body? But what were some of the norms or the values that we learned in the past, and do we think that the youth of today are getting those same values and norms? And so the second one I have already discussed is, what are the shared values? Can we define them, and how are they formed? And the next one is, what traditions are being taught today and handed down, and where are our youth getting those from? And the last one, if we get to it, is what Ardmore Douglas all Black traditions are being taught. Was there something specific in the water at Ardmore Douglas or any of the other all Black environments that we were exposed to? What were some of those traditions that are special? And I think that's the easy one, because we've been talking about that from day one, is our memories are what sustains us. Lanzetta has such warm memories. And so those are values that she took with her no matter where she was. And so we want to find out what special values. Kwame, we would like to know, what values did your mom and dad pass on to you? And how did you absorb them? Did you appreciate them at the time too? Because one of the things that the African-American community created was a warm and nurturing environment. And sometimes that meant chastising you or punishing you. So it was warm in several ways. And so what are other traditions that kept you safe? One of the things, the nurturing environment was meant to keep us safe from a world that was not safe because of racism and discrimination. So, and is that same world created now for our youth? You know, and how can we get it back if it's not? So that kind of sets the agenda. So I invite any of you to jump in and talk about whatever you feel like you want to start with.
Well, I can start. I know that, again, as everybody knows, my mom, Lanzetta James Bruce, and also my father, Douglas Bruce, both were from Ardmore. And I think what they instilled in me is what they received from their parents. And again, like you were talking about, Dorscine, is that these people were hardworking. They were extremely family oriented, and they just loved their community. So much so that I wished I was there in Ardmore. I'm their child, and I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, But let me tell you, I feel like I know so much about Ardmore and the people there that I feel like I actually live there. My mother lived at 601 First Avenue Southeast, and she lived right off of Main Street, and she talked to me so much about the times when she grew up. And she even talked to me about the teachers she had, like Mrs. Lackey, who was the home economics teacher that taught her how to sew and taught her how to cook food and things like that, as well as my grandmother, obviously. But she said Mrs. Lackey would be so dedicated to her job at the school that if they just made something as simple as toast, just toast, she would make sure that they buttered the bread all the way to the edges, or you would get an F, you know? So just small, simple things like that she constantly told me about. And again, I think it's something that I just grew up knowing, and just like the times I would talk about my grandmother being on the front porch and talking to so many people in her community, and people coming by and stopping by, and you know, the fruit people that would come through the town and bring bushels of fruit, and people would get together and peel pears or whatever the case is. It was just a huge community base of folk that you saw all the time, whether you were at school, whether you were at church, you know, just your whole dealings was with that community, which we don't seem to have that anymore. And I just find that to be, for me, something that I wish that I could have experienced. So again, it seems like everybody in the town knew each other. Everybody was friendly with each other. If in fact there was a problem, you know, obviously somebody would get after somebody from time to time, but they seemed to squash, you know, their differences. And, you know, it was just a fabulous community. So again, hindsight, with me being in the younger generation here, I just really wish that I could have experienced what she experienced.
Mhm. Mhm. And
Let me speak. Is that okay?
sure.
Okay. I was born and raised in Kansas City, Kansas. However, my parents, they were not from Ardmore proper. They were from Berwyn, Oklahoma, and Spigner, Oklahoma. However, we spent our summers in Berwyn, Gene Autry, as they call it. The values that we were taught now, and they're the same values I taught my children. We were of a farming community, and I guess the closest neighbor was a good half a mile, but everything was shared. They had 88 acres of playground as far as I was concerned. Gardens, livestock, you name it, that a farm would have, that would be there. The biggest thing that I remember, and I was talking to Cedric about this a little bit ago, my great-great-great-grandfather started the Calvary Baptist Church there in Berwyn, Oklahoma. Religion was the biggest thing that is carried forward to this day. As far as my children are concerned, we speak in terms of a great spirit, not necessarily a Jesus, God, or whatever. A lot of the things that my grandmother, who spent a lot of time on, I think they call them verandas now, them wraparound porches, whatever they call them. But she would churn butter out there with her grandbabies, because we were city kids and we were wow. But she taught us so many things just sitting there. My grandmother would never discipline us as far as whipping or anything. The thing I remember most that she said was, there's going to come a time in life when all you have is each other. So when we fought among ourselves, that was time for punishment, but she didn't do it. She would make us go out and get switches. Each one of us had one. She'd make us lock hands, and we go around in circles beating each other to death until we figured out, I don't hit you so hard, you won't hit me that hard, and we would eventually stop. And that's when we got the sermon of, it's going to come a time in life when all you have is each other. Right now, I'm 77 years old. I'm at that time of life. There are 4 of us left, and all we have is each other. Not to say that the community doesn't count, but I know those 3 people love me. That much I do know. But as far as values are concerned, what my mother gathered from her mother was taught to me. My children are well versed in their history, where they came from, how they got here. Our biggest problem is our school systems are not doing that. And that's where we can do it individually, but as a community there, that saying it took a village, regardless of if you were in the city or in the country, it took a village to raise us. And today it's not so much. It's like, if you touch my child, I'm gonna hurt you. So I think gardening, canning, cooking, because I use my grandmother's recipes and I can cook, or what they call it, burn. I can stick my foot in it, however they want to put it. But that came from Rhoda Roberts Pickens. So that's all I wanted to throw in there right now that I can think of.
I got to ask you a question right quick, because you said the name of Ned Roberts. That is your great grandfather.
No, my
great
great-grandfather's name was Edmund. His father's name was Ned.
Yeah, well, we got people that's on board. We got Lisa that's joining us out of Houston, Pastor Michael, he's here in Ardmore. And so I'm looking at the feed too of the people. So if you have a comment, you can post it on our Facebook page and I'll be able to read those questions back. And I also want to make sure that everybody looks at that camera so they can see it. But let me just ask you, what story did you hear about Mr. Ned Roberts? Because I've read over his information, and most of those people were Chickasaws and Choctaws.
They are. And there is actually some, I haven't quite finished it yet, but we can probably go through all 5 of the tribes and find the blood of the Roberts. However, but the Chickasaws and the Choctaws are most important. Ned Roberts was the one who married, okay, I'm getting genealogy on you, married Lanny, Sarah Stevenson, or Sarah Colbert, however they want to put it, which was the daughter of Lanny Colbert Stevenson. I gotta put those names together, which was the daughter of, help me, Terry, Major James Colbert. Is that the way it goes, Terry?
Yeah, I believe it's James Colbert.
James Colbert. But I have to say Major because there was more than one James Colbert.
Correct.
Was actually the son of the Chickasaw. He was a chief, wasn't he?
At one point, but if he wasn't a chief, he was among the leadership.
Okay, let's go with the leadership. He was among the leadership. So as far as me tracing my Indian heritage, I was looking at my DNA profile yesterday. They've updated it for anybody that hasn't been in to check on a DNA that you've done, Ancestry of 1, 2, 3. They've done some update on it. But a lot of people, they want to look at me, and I am, can't prove it, but I am of African descent. I am, based on my DNA. Where I came from, based on regions, I can tell you that. But unlike Alex Haley, I don't have a name. But as far as my Native American, Indigenous Americans, I'll put it that way, I can pinpoint all the way back to the 1600s. I can do that. But I'm getting into genealogy and I didn't want to get into that. I wanted to get into the history of Ardmore and pretty much the questions that.
But it ties into it, and I appreciate you sharing that. Now, I do have a question, Dorscine. I need a little bit more definition, and Terry, you might happen, but why do we have to refer to state Negroes? Why is that term so used during that time period, Dr. Littles?
Well, as you know, the natives came to Oklahoma with the tribes that were being transported out of the South, and so they had the natives with them because they'd been slaves to them in the plantations that they had in the South. And as I mentioned the first day, as horrendous as the trek on the Trail of Tears, or the real interpretation is the place where we cried. If they had not had those slaves with them, a much larger portion of the natives would have died, because the slaves worked as cooks, nurses, clearing the paths and all of that. So they made the journey just a little bit less horrendous. And so they came in with the natives. And then with the treaties of 1866, the US government made the tribes get rid of the land in common. And so everybody had to get a parcel of land anywhere from 160, 320 acres to 40 acres. And so they were proponents of individual ownership instead of group ownership of the land. And this was so that they could free up the land for the Europeans that were coming in from Europe and from the East Coast and other places. So the slaves that had come, they had adapted to the Indian lifestyle. They spoke 2 or 3 languages. They ate the food. They had the cultural habits. My great aunt, I'm deviating, but I grew up eating something called tomfuller. Has anybody ever heard of that?
I have.
Okay, tomfuller is like a hominy. That was an Indian dish. I didn't know what it was, but we had it pretty often.
Yeah.
And grape dumplings. That was an Indian dish. So they had adapted. They didn't have the African, they didn't know their African roots. So they didn't have the food that the people that came in from the South that had come recently from Africa to the South. So they had the diet of the Native Americans. They were intermarried with the Native Americans. So they were culturally, they were Native Americans, even though, DNA wise, they might have had full blood African or mixed blood African. So when the South, the Native Americans and the South lost the war, the government was in control. The Native Americans lost their sovereignty. And as I mentioned, they joined either side of the war, either the North or the South, because they were trying to protect their sovereignty, and they thought that they would gain more if they were on the winning side. And so one group picked the North and thought that they would win, and one group of the same tribe picked the South and thought that they would win, and they thought that they would gain more control of their affairs and their lives. It didn't happen. And then, by the way, there were slaves in the South before the war. There were slaves that were running away from the slave masters in the South to Indian Territory because they had heard that slavery was different in Oklahoma than it was in the South. And to a certain extent it was, because the slaves could live in their own houses, and they could grow their own vegetables or crops or whatever, and they would give part of it to the slave master, but they could keep part of it for themselves and sell it or do whatever they wanted to. So they had little enterprises where they could be more independent. And in many cases, their families weren't sold like the native or like the slaves in the South. So there was differences in slavery in Indian Territory.
I got you on that. Now I want to show y'all this book right here. This book is what I've been reading for the last 2 months. It is written by a man by the name of Paul Frame. The book is entitled A History of Ardmore, Oklahoma, from the Early Beginnings to 1907. I want to share with you a paragraph. As you know, the old high school that's downtown, that's on Washington Street, and that building was built like in 1912. But just imagine what school was like for Black people before Oklahoma became a state. And it talks about a man by the name of J.R. Hendricks, who comes from Plano, Texas. He becomes the first school superintendent for Ardmore. The date was July the 11th, 1899. 19 teachers took the examination for the position for Ardmore schools. They were examined in spelling, reading, arithmetic, psychology, civil government, geography, grammar, methods, and management. All teachers so examined and passed their examinations. They were employed by the city of Ardmore schools at a salary ranging from $30 to $50 a month, depending on their training and experience. Now, check this out. It says a Negro principal and 2 Negro teachers were also hired. Former and graduate teacher college received $30 a month during that time period. There were 4 small frame buildings that were built on each ward of the schools. If you notice now in Ardmore, your elected officials, and Kwame, your mother, represented Ward 2 or 3, whatever it was. They had 4 wards during that time period. And later on, they brought in Charles Evans to be the the superintendent. So when they started the schools, basically the schools, the Indians had their schools, and that's why they named it after Charles Carter, how you got Carter County. But before he became, involved, it was Pickens County during that time period. So there was a lot of things going on. But notice when I read, it says Negroes. So we weren't even entitled to have a name during that time period. So that's why I asked the question, state Negroes. Why? What's going on here? And Dorscine, I want to bring you back. Okay, Terry, you got a question, and then go back to Dorscine. I got a question. Go ahead, Terry.
Well, addressing the issue of state Negro versus freedmen, you have to remember this is a political designation that was given these individuals by the people who were in charge of Indian Territory. Remember again, Indian Territory was not part of the United States. Therefore, all the people who lived there had to be there with the permission of the tribes. Otherwise, they were intruders. So a state Negro, up until the point of statehood in 1907, was to be distinguished from a freedman during this period of time. And there was always the schism that was attributed to the 2 groups in order to keep them separate. So you can distinguish one person as a freedman as opposed to one who was a state Negro, and you didn't want them joining forces because they became a political party, a political body that they had to deal with. That is the basis for the name. Whether you interpret it as being derogatory or not, it still does not address the issue that these people did become family and interrelated. Many of the freedmen married in with state Negroes, so-called state Negroes. So again, I think they're using that in order to keep us separate. And before I go off and let you finish, the Carter County was named after Charles D. Carter's father, who was a Cherokee. And Charles D. Carter was one of the most racist congressmen from Oklahoma, who on the congressional floor fought tooth and nail with the rest of the delegation from Oklahoma, except for one person who was Bird McGuire. They fought his picture to keep any freedman. Pardon? Sure.
I'm going to show you his picture right now. So I'm going to bring up on my screen, see if I can do this right now. Can y'all see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's Charles D.
That's Charles David Carter. And on this side of the book, and this is another book, that's Edmund Pickens.
Yes, it is.
Now, if you look at it, it says he was from 1789, that's when he was born, to 1868. And then Chickasaw Cherokee, Charles David Carter, 1868 to 1929. This book is on the Indian Territory of Carter County. It goes on further to tell you, this goes all the way to the history to 1982. So there's research out here that I've been reading to study and all this. And you're absolutely right, Terry, what was happening during that time period. But my question, I got to ask Dorscine Spigner Littles about her family and her great-grandfather. How were they able to acquire the land and get all the buildings on Main Street during that time period?
my grandfather was from Alabama, and there's Spigners in Alabama, black and white. And my grandfather was the slave owner's son. My great grandfather, Albert Spigner, was the son of the plantation owner in Alabama. And Albert Spigner, now I have no documentation of this. This is only with my uncle. My uncle regaled me with all of my history, and sometimes it sounded so fantastical I couldn't believe it was true. But my great grandfather, Albert Spigner, married a person that was on, he said, was one of the last group of slaves that came in on the ship. And so it was three siblings that came in on the ship in South Carolina. There was Ackland, who was my great grandmother that married Albert. There was Sookie, and there was George. And so they were slaves on the Spigner plantation in South Carolina. And George didn't have to work because he was a conjurer. So he could make snakes come to him.
Wait, you got hold it. You messed me up. What was he now? Sandy, did you see my face on that one? What was he?
They called him a conjurer.
You got to explain that one. I'm listening.
Well, it's like a witch doctor.
Oh, Lord.
So anyway, supposedly he didn't have to work. And then when the slave owner that had them in South Carolina moved to Alabama, he brought all three of his slaves with him, Sookie, Ackland, and George. And that's where Ackland met Albert. Ackland was full-blood African, 100%. And Albert was mulatto. And so they got married.
Hold that thought now. You got to tell them some of the people, the young people that are watching, they don't know the meaning of mulatto. Go ahead and break that down.
Okay. I don't know I don't know the genealogy of Ackland, but she was full-blood African on the last ship or so that came into harbor from Africa. So she didn't have any mixed blood. She was full-blood African. If you are half white and half black, you were called mulatto. And Albert was the plantation owner's son, and his mother was African, so he was half black and half white. And I'll digress a little bit. My cousin, first cousin, he moved back to Oklahoma from California, and so this Tatum Cemetery is about a half a mile from my grandparents' house. And the sheriff of Carter County tours all of Carter County. And so he was going through Tatum's and he saw these white people up at the Tatum Cemetery. So he went over to my cousin's house, JR, and he said, JR, there's some white people at the Tatum Cemetery looking at your family's plot. And so JR got in the car and went up there. And it's one of our relatives in South Carolina. He hired a private detective, and the private detective went all over the United States to find all of the Spigners, black and white. And not only did he find the live Spigners, he went to graveyards and to find all of the cemeteries where all the Spigners. So he's published a book that has all of the cemetery plots of the Spigners, as well as a lot of pictures of all of the Spigners, black and white. I don't know why he didn't take my picture, but I'm not I'm not in there. But anyway, so all Spigners supposedly are related, and so we have a book with hundreds of thousands of names of Spigners. So my grandfather left Alabama and moved to Texas. I know this is taking a long time, but he moved to Texas. he had a brother named Daniel, and they heard that land was, if not free in Oklahoma, you could get it like for $1/4 an acre or $1 an acre. And so my grandfather in Texas had bought land in Texas, but the racism was still a little bit more harsh in Texas. So he thought he would take his chances in Oklahoma. So he came to Tatum's, Oklahoma, and he bought 160 acres, which is 1/4 of a section. And he started farming. First of all, he built a grocery store. So he had a grocery store and he was farming. And in 1907, I think, the Hilton oil field came in, and it was one of the largest oil fields in the nation. And so the white people in Hilton was all white town. It also was the center of the Ku Klux Klan. That was one of their headquarters, was Hilton, Oklahoma. And so a lot of the people in Hilton got wealthy overnight from oil. And so after the oil companies had drilled in Hilton, they started going west, and they would go west gradually. So the Tatum's people, they was waiting, for the oil company to get there to them. So when the oil companies got to Tatum's, they stopped at the line, and they drilled on the other side of the line, and they slant drilled under the surface. So they were on the white side of the line on the surface, but underneath they were drilling oil. And so they did that. That's called starving our people, so they could get the best deal with the when they signed the contract, that they would have an advantage over the Black people, because the Black people were starving, wanting their oil money, So they got contracts. And right now I'm a royalty owner, and I'm bound to those contracts. I cannot negotiate. I cannot do anything. They're drilling right now on our property, and we're still held to the contract that was signed in 1922. Those oil wells have been pumping for 100 years. That's how my grandfather bought both sides of Main Street.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. So, and that just so happened to be in the hot spot of Ardmore, right there on where Main Street is, right?
No, the farm in Tatum's is the one that's producing all the oil.
It was there, and that's what happened. But
So he had a huge income. Well, a huge income, but in that by terms of 1922. I think they started producing in 1907 or 1908 or something like that.
Wow.
But he went to Ardmore. He eventually went to Ardmore and started buying up property. And like I said, he had 2 hotels that he rented out to the military, which was an Army base first and then an Air Force base. And just to tell you another story about my grandfather.
Go ahead.
As I said, my grandfather was born in 1867. And I don't know what kind of education he had or anything, but he was educated doing Reconstruction. So, but he had a business mind. So after he got the money, he was trying to set all of his children. He and my grandmother had 10 children. So he dictated what professions he wanted them to have. So he sent one of my uncles to Texas to be a mortician. He sent another uncle to Texas to business school, so he would be the business manager. And then he did a survey. This was in the 1900s, early 1900s. He did a survey to see where would be the best place to place a funeral home. So he looked at the entire state of Oklahoma, and he looked at Idabel, Oklahoma. Idabel sits in the corner of Oklahoma. And within a 100-mile radius of Idabel, there was not a funeral home. and you had Arkansas that was touching Oklahoma. You had Louisiana that was touching Oklahoma, and you had Texas that was touching Oklahoma. And then he had Oklahoma. So he had, and at that time they had what was called a burial association. So when anybody died, everybody that was in burial association sent $1 for the burial. And so my uncle said that my uncle, that he was not my real uncle, but I called him my uncle because we were really close. He was Uncle Dan's son, my grandfather's son. He was my grandfather's nephew. So he went down to Idabel one time to the funeral home to visit my two uncles, the mortician and the bookkeeper. And he said they sat up all night counting dollars. But anyway, my uncle that was a mortician was scared of dead people. so anyway, I'll stop right there.
What's the name of y'all go ahead, Kwame. Everybody, y'all go ahead, Kwame. Go ahead.
Okay, we're dealing with a whole lot of culture here. And I think one of the basis of Dr. Little's question and what we were discussing about the high cultural values that Ardmorites had, or people from Carter County or Southeastern. Now, Dr. Spigner touched on a very, very asset that I think it has really bonded Black people, African people together all over that area. That's culture. And one of the things she said about her great grandfather, whoever, established that funeral home in Idabel, Oklahoma, and then took up on collective communalism, collective economics to get the whole thing started. So we're talking about two different things right here, or really the same thing. We're talking about how we put our money together and build some big business at that time by pooling our resources together to get things done. And that happened over 100 years ago. Now, right now, we are in the midst of battle of this capitalism, so to speak. But yet and still, I think we pose the question too, like, how can we go get back and doing some of the things that propel us as a race of people back? And that is pooling our money together to get some things done. So they did it back. Dr. Little's great grandfather, correct me if I'm right or wrong, did that.
That was a grandfather.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
Did that in their survey.
It was a big age difference between my grandparents.
Well, I gotta ask a question, Kwame and Dorscine. The banks, the money, where they put the money at?
I have no idea. My two uncles, one of my uncles had to go, the one that had the level head and was the manager, he had to go into the military. So when he left, everything fell apart. Like I said, my uncle, who was the mortician, was scared of dead people. He didn't want to be my grandfather was kind of like a dictator. So he told you be the mortician, you be the accountant, and he picked professions for every one of his children.
Well, let me ask this question, there, Cedric or Dr. Lills, or were there any Black banks in the early 1900s that it was established by Black people? Do you know of any?
I don't. I'm not sure. I didn't. I know that when my grandfather died when I was 5, and so they lived pretty large. You know, I grew up poor, relatively poor. So, but my grandfather and grandmother, they always went to. He didn't, because of segregation in Oklahoma, they didn't go to the doctors and hospitals in Oklahoma. They would go to the Mayo Clinic. And so he had to have money. I don't know if you ever heard of Jake Simmons, but Jake Simmons was an oil man in Muskogee, and he drilled oil wells in Africa. So he's very well known. But anyway, he came to Tatum's and asked my grandfather for the money to start his oil company.
Wow.
And so he was a young man. My grandfather was so impressed with him. My grandfather and grandmother moved. They built a house in Muskogee and moved to Muskogee to help him start his oil company. And so he helped Jake Simmons start the oil company that he founded. And you can look him up. But he didn't do the right thing by my grandfather.
Well, how did we control our money? We pooled it together, true enough, but that would be something interesting to research, is how we really pooled our collective money and did things from there.
I'll tell you one other thing my grandfather did. I'm pretty proud of him, and I don't want to, dominate the conversation, but the Black people back that time, a lot of Black people lost their land because of taxes. They didn't understand taxes if they were natives or whatever. And so after my grandfather got wealthy, people would come to him to borrow money. And and if they had land or whatever asset, he would loan them the money, and he would have them to sign their land over to him for whatever amount of money he loaned them. And so he would pay their taxes, loan them the money. He would hold the deed for the land, and then when they could pay him back, he would return the deed to them. His name is probably on almost everybody's land in Tatum's, Oklahoma. And an attorney was the one that called me and asked me, he said, who is E.R. Spigner? And I said, that's my grandfather. He said, his name is in and out on so many pieces of land, but he didn't take advantage of them. He would pay their taxes or give them the amount of money that they asked. And the only thing he asked was for them to pay him back. So he saved a lot of Black people's land for them. And on his deathbed, he sent a message to me and to my his other grandchildren, and he told us, he said, never sell the land, because the land will always take care of you. And that was his last words.
Well, let me ask you this question, put it out there. How many Black businesses did we have on the East Main, say in 1920 and 1930? I know the hotel was there. I think the Roberts had a lot of property there as well. So do anybody have a pretty good estimate of the land, but the business that we had on East Main?
The Ladies of Action published a book with all the Black businesses in Ardmore. And it was very impressive. As I said, my grandfather was quite a bit older than my grandmother, and he was like an old man when he became wealthy. And he, after he became ill, I mentioned he went to the Mayo Clinic, and the Mayo Clinic, it diagnosed him with congestive heart failure. And so he had to stop taking care of business. He went home and went to bed and stayed in bed for 5 years with congestive heart failure. So a lot of his businesses were lost during that time.
Well, does anybody else have a question? Terry, anybody else? Martin?
Kwame, it's good to see you again. Good to talk to you.
Nice
I think
talking
you're
to you.
bringing up some very good questions, and they are probably apropos for today about community and pooling our monies together in order to create an environment where people can prosper. Now, the question of where were the banks during this period of time, I think we're looking through the lens of today and trying to apply it to the times that our ancestors lived in. And there may not have been those type of banks for them, except I can only recall vaguely there being something over in Muskogee with who's the brother the Black Panther Oil Company, J. Cootie Johnson. And he may have had part of a bank ownership. And that information, like you say, is
I
it's
think
probably worthwhile doing some researching on.
I
Okay,
think
but
he was Jake Simmons' relative.
he may
Jake-
be
Yeah, I think he
because
was-
they're both Creeks.
Mhm.
But I see that value, those cultural ties. I think these are the things that we are going to have to really look at seriously in order to go forward. And looking at the situation that you have in these small communities that were where Ardmore is like the central cog to these peripheral communities: Berwyn, Milo, Newport, Woodford, Wynnewood, all of these other towns that we had large communities of Black people, and they had to be pooling their money together. You mentioned the Burial Association, which probably doubled as a bank because they were accepting money from people.
No,
So it's probably not that far fetched to see where that money was going and how it would have improved the community. I think what you were drilling down on is the velocity of money in the Black community, which
Right.
dollars only circulate that fast and they're gone.
it was like,
Well, during the times of our ancestors, that dollar was circulating quite a bit, and it was touching the hands of all these different families, these different farming communities, and so everyone was feeding from the trough and being fed. Well, today you don't have that same situation. You talk about the businesses on Main Street. That's an easy enough assignment to look at because they produce with the telephone books, city directories from those times. So we can go back and look at who was present at a certain time in a certain year at a certain address quite easily, and it's probably worthwhile because what you're trying to do is preserve the history of the area. And these are the tools that are going to help you do that. But in order to do it, you need to start pooling your money and getting it into a frame of mind that you are going to help that community and every family that originated from it.
I was gonna say, let me just say this one thing. I think my grandfather put his money in the bank. I think he did.
He may have.
Because he was perceived as wealthy, he operated like a white person. So he had doors open to him that a lot of Black people didn't. And so I'm pretty sure that because one of the banks is a bank in Ardmore named Exchange National Bank, and I know that he had money in that bank.
And I don't doubt that, but again, when you were talking about people losing their land, you can go to a newspaper from the 20s and 30s and see it looked like the foreclosure crisis in the late 90s or 2000s, where people were losing land, not just for taxes, but because they were not educated. The majority of people were not educated on the ownership of land and what it costs to keep it. When we look at in fact, when you look at some of that stuff, they were taking loans from banks who foreclosed on their land, their property. And that's how you saw a lot of farmland changing hands. And if we're not going to make ourselves aware of that history, we're going to be subject to it again.
Terry, are you related to the Abram family?
Yes, in a certain way.
Well,
I'm glad you bring that up because I had a chance to look at that video last week, and I was Ed Abram.
Ed Abram
Now
owns.
there's two Ed Abrams.
Well, he was JB's father.
Senior, junior. Okay.
Anyway, he owns 640 acres. That's a section.
He owned more than 640 acres. This is why I was jumping through the screen last week when I saw that video. This is why we have to be aware of the interrelationship between state Negroes and freedmen. Exactly. Ed Abram was a freedman. His wife, Amanda Stevenson, correct me if I'm wrong, Eleanor, was on the blood roll. Every child in that Abram family, except for Ed, got 320 acres of land, and it was a big family.
Mm-hmm. Okay? And he was cheating out of his land.
He may have been, but again, Ed was, this is what really irks me about how people treat the history of freedmen. These people came out of slavery not knowing thing one about owning land, but they had a bunch of land dropped on them and they were expected to handle it just like the average white man during that time who was out there trying to get it from him. Okay.
Mhm.
And so Ed, bless his heart, held on to enough of that land that he was able to help his children. Because if you look at that same book that you were showing last week, which Sandy had in her hand a minute ago, the Abram family is featured in that book.
Yeah.
My connection to that family is a woman sitting on that sofa with the Abram family, Myrtle Abrams.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right there on the left side, that's Myrtle Douglas Abrams. Right there in the middle, underneath that man standing to the left. That's my connection to them.
Did she marry Shannon Myrtle?
Ooh.
No.
Oh, you want to go to the Shannons, huh?
Yeah, well, Shannon just died in Kansas City, Missouri last
Yeah,
month.
Henry Shannon.
Henry Shannon, I think that was his mother.
I never knew if she had children.
Okay,
That's wasn't Henry.
but I'll
But
take, but
I
I'll
think,
take it.
I think the question, what we're looking at right now is Mr. Ligon was talking about, how did we pool our money back then 100 years ago? It wasn't in the banks and things of this nature. We wasn't borrowing any money from no white folks. We were pooling our money in some way. And how can we go back? This all goes back to cultural economics. How can we go back? I think that was the question that you established, first of all, or said to establish, like, how can we go back to move forward, to pool our money and bring it back some more great things that we did 100 years ago. If it wasn't in the banks, we did pool our money, we did pool our resources to get some great things done.
I think one thing that Dorscine, I believe it was Dorscine, said that people would give her grandfather their money and he was honest enough to give them value for value.
Mhm.
Well, the essence of that is trust.
Mhm.
They trusted him and he trusted them to pay it back.
Right.
Well, for us to move forward as a community nowadays, we have to start trusting one another.
Exactly.
Can I say this as far as money back then? Terry, I'm sure you are well aware of the Freedmen Association.
Yes.
Back there prior to and including the Dawes Commission, a lot of money was dropped there. All the attorneys that were paid for were through the Freedmen Association. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure out that that's where the money was held. Did they put it in the bottom of a well? Probably. Didn't necessarily go into a bank, but everything was paid. I can't say everything. A lot of things were paid through that Freedmen Association to prove we, the Black Indians, for lack of a better word, they were fighting for our rights to be on the roll without a blood quantum, although we got one. The Dawes Commission or the Congress, they're the ones that separated. They did that great divide. Wait, I got to do this. I have to do this right here. Way back when, you all need to know, and this is more or less for your recording or video thing. When Andrew Jackson signed that Indian Removal Act, and those Indians or those Black people, if you want to call them that, they were not slaves. They were my grandparents. They were free people that owned land east of the Mississippi. Andrew Jackson would not allow a person of color to go across the Trail of Tears as a free person. Therefore, they were slaves on paper. I need that to be known because every Black person that came across the Trail of Tears was not a slave. And anybody that's listening to this, and you want to find who they were, although they don't have names, go to the 1860 Arkansas census, and on the very back end of that are all of those paper slaves. If you know their age, if you know their owners, if you know anything, you can find your person that was free before Andrew Jackson signed that paper. I'm sorry, I had to clean that up. Because state Negroes, when you start defining them, Indian territory did not belong to the United States. When they speak of state Negroes, they're talking about any of those that came in from any place other than Indian territory. The purpose of the Dawes Commission allotting all of that land, I'll put it that way, they didn't allot it, but as far as all that happened before they allowed the Negroes to come in there and grab land. Dorscine is saying that her grandfather came from where? Someplace. He was a state Negro, is that true?
Yeah, yes, and
He came in and bought up land, but all the land, Indian land, was allotted prior to them allowing that to happen. Okay, I'm done.
and I'm gonna put this footnote in there too, because it might be relevant. But my grandfather bought his land in Tatum's, the 160 acres he bought. He bought it from the Chickasaw Nation. I think he paid $1 an acre. And so the Chickasaw Nation is a sovereign nation. So I've had several of my cousins that have become elderly and ill, and they had to go into nursing homes. So I had one relative in Norman, Oklahoma. She had to go into a nursing home. She had to turn her royalty check over to the nursing home, never to get it back. I had another cousin that lives in Portland, Oregon, and she's one of those researchers that researches everything. And so when she had to go into the nursing home and she revealed her income, there is a law that because that land was owned by the Chickasaw, who are a sovereign nation, the government, they cannot take your check. So that's for anybody that you know that may one day go into the nursing home. If they have any land that they acquired through the Indian tribe, they don't have to give their assets up, because that contract was with a sovereign nation and not with the U.S. government.
One other thing about that is people don't seem to realize that, number one, that land should have been protected as far as the United States was concerned. Just like all that other Indian land that was protected, so was all the so-called freedmen land. It should have been protected too. However, when these banks, like Jerry said, they took loans out on farms and stocks and whatever, and the banks started foreclosing on these people, they didn't lose the mineral rights. My royalty checks are still intact. The land is not. In other words, like your grandfather said, never sell the land. I have some uncles that did sell some land. However, those titles,
So do I. They didn't listen.
They're not quiet because I never signed a thing. And you can't do anything without all signatures. But the mineral rights did not go with the land. They can get the land, but you can't get the mineral rights. So that's something other people need to know too.
I think we're getting into another topic now. We're talking about air property, and we're talking about 100 years ago, and then we start putting that in the mathematical equation. You probably have 10,000 arrows for that property right now. So we're talking about collective ownership, pooling our money together, and how can we do something as arrows without squabbling over it and selling stuff? How can we pool those resources together for your greater effort right now? What we're trying to do as a people.
You give me 5,000 people, I'll show you $1 million.
The key word
1 year.
is very good out there, trust. We don't trust one another. And until we get to a point where we can do that, and we get to a point where you can unify, everything we're saying is moot.
Wow,
true.
Until we get to that point. And at 77 years old, we haven't got there yet.
There is the old African proverb: a man will plant a tree never to sit underneath its shade. That's our duty as elders.
Exactly.
That's right.
Take that to carry it forward. I agree.
Now we plant the seed for others to prosper from.
Wow. Well, listen, hey, we're about out of time. And
like I said, 5,000 No, sir, I have to say it. You show me 5,000 people who will give me $5 a week for 1 year, and you will have over $1 million. That's power.
Got to
Wow.
do it without making it a Ponzi scam. You know how
Back in
It's
the,
not a
back in-
Ponzi scam. If
back
I
in-
give you, if you put $5 a week into the bank for 52 weeks, $260 a year, 5,000 people is more than $1 million. And now you don't have to take anything out of it. You just put it in the bank.
that's what the Asians do. The Asians
You
all
don't
get
have to
together
trust me. Do the
and,
math yourself.
and they put their money in a pot. And when it gets to a certain amount, one person is designated that they can buy their own house with cash.
No, you don't have one person to
And
control.
so
the
that's
money.
how they
You have three people.
acquire home ownership so quickly, is because they merge their money, and then they'll buy that person out. That person will get a house. Then the next person in line will get a house, and so on and so forth. That's how they build wealth so quickly.
Yeah.
Or you put together a fund, an endowment for people to get schools, scholarships in order to educate themselves, to bring them back, just like your grandfather said. You are going to be a lawyer. You are going to be a teacher. You are going to be a doctor. This is how you build up that culture and take the same thing, that the lessons that you are already spewing. This is not rocket science. This
Yeah.
is very simple stuff, and you already have an example of it.
I got a
But
suggestion.
in New York City in the 20s, it was a group that did merge, pool their money. I can't remember what happened to them, but that
Have you ever heard of savings clubs?
yeah.
It's the same thing, same principle.
That's what I
You have a
saw.
group of people that get together, they pool their money together, and they go out and buy real estate. They go out and buy houses. They go out and do this, that, and the other in order to generate generational wealth. This is not rocket science,
They
but
put
we don't trust one another to do that.
Wall Street, Terry.
We don't have to be talking about Asians right now. There is a young lady who wrote a book. She's a doctor. She did a book called Collective Economics, where
Mhm.
African people or Black people did the same thing. And it's not an Asian situation. We did the same thing. Another question I would like to say, like, if we do have these mineral rights, we don't have to, we can just, it's not going to be like 100%, you know that. We could just, people who have these mineral rights coming in, put that in the collective resources, and you could do some great things, not in a year's time. You could do some in a week's time, just by mineral rights. Those are some thoughts that I would like to put out there as for how we could do something and move forward to, because the Indians are doing it in Oklahoma, pulling their resources together and doing some great things. 20 years ago, nobody didn't want to be Indian, but everybody want to be Indian right now because of what they're doing so in casinos and things of this nature.
That's
The only
true.
thing we have to be united and
Sandy, have you ran your DNA?
Pardon me?
I was asking Sandy. I said, Sandy, have you done your DNA?
You're muted, Sandy.
You're mute.
Yes, I have. And, the same thing that everybody's talking about has happened in my family too. Obviously, going back to what Eleanor was saying, my family is the Chicos. And, we were brought over again by, the Chickasaw Indian Chico family. My family became the Gordons, the Loves, Gaines. We have the same thing. We have we have the oil mineral rights out in Cheek as well as Long Grove. And so we're all dealing with the same aspects that everybody's talking about. And somehow we need to all pull all of this stuff together and somehow come together again and, do something with this. Terry and I belong to a new group that we're also calling the CCFA. And my great grandfather was one of the members of the CCFA, and that was Wilson Chico. And so we are trying to establish this once again, where we as Chickasaw or Choctaw freedmen come together and do some good. So that's one of the things I wanted to say.
You want me to tell you, we can all within an hour, if the word trust comes into play, if every descendant of the 20,000 people enumerated on the Dawes Commission provided $1,
Absolutely. That's absolutely. You're absolutely right, Eleanor.
And it ain't gonna hurt.
You're
And-
absolutely right, Eleanor. And that's, again, this is why we have started this new group, the CCFA, again, based off of what our ancestors did back in, the 1800s. I'm a Shiko, and he was on that very organization. I'm a Love. Simon Love was on that organization. So me as a descendant of theirs, I have to be on this organization as well.
Wow, you guys have really hit something tonight. And Dorscine, we want people who get a chance to watch this. How can they reach you? Or why don't you give your information, Sandy? If you can give just an email or someone want to reach you as well. And
Yeah, you can reach me at let's see. I'll give you my individual email right now, which is just swillia14@yahoo.com. Or you can also reach Terry and I at CCFA Now. It's ccfanow.org. And we also have an email that's called, it's at info at CCFA Now.
they're going to be calling me and asking me, and I say, I'm going to make sure I get this information. We ain't going to be like this guy that then took off all this money and ran off Bernie Madoff's, that other guy.
Absolutely.
I forgot his name, but y'all know who I'm talking about with this crypto and all that stuff,
We trust you. We trust you to,
No, look at this.
I'm gonna join tonight.
Look at this, Cedric. I didn't grow up in Ardmore. I grew up in Watts, California. And so I kind of envy you guys who had an opportunity to have an experience on the ground in Oklahoma, in Ardmore, in Berwyn, in Tatum's, because your experiences are far different from mine. And my exposure to this history only came late in life. So when people ask me, I tell them, no, I didn't live in Oklahoma, but Oklahoma lives in me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so what I do and what I have been doing unselfishly for the past 30 some odd years or more is try to educate myself on this history. That's why I think it's important that we understand that we have ties, if you were a freedman or not a freedman. But if you have a history in Ardmore and the surrounding areas, you are family. That's first.
Absolutely.
Now,
Absolutely.
Eleanor and I share DNA. Okay.
Right.
Our
That's it.
grandmother, Margaret.
That's exactly it, Terry. I mean, yeah, when I look at my family names, and I am a Shiko, I'm a Pickens, just like you are, Eleanor, a Gordon, a Mitchell, a Cheadle. Those are my family names on my grandfather's side. On my grandmother's side, I have the Loves, the Douglases, the Gaines, all these people that were all around Carter County, and some then came into Carter County. My families were from everywhere from Yarnaby, southeast Oklahoma, all the way to Tishomingo, to Wiley, and also Cheek, that whole Cheek Love area as well. So we all know this area extremely well, and we need to come together and do some things at this point.
Wow, you guys have been phenomenal. We're about to go. As I always try to do, Dr. Littles will have the final word, and I'm going to pull up a picture. Can y'all see my screen right now?
Right.
Arnold Dean Watson and Raymond Watson.
Class of 1958, Douglas High School.
Mhm.
1959, Ardmore Douglas High School. Their mother's name, Martha Millinery. Her beauty shop was located at 38 East Street Southeast. And you know what? On East Street Southeast, she was probably one of the first two Black people that lived on East Street Southeast. If you know where the Woodies live, right there on that street right there, and the McGee's, Virginia, Griffin, and the McGee's, do you remember where her business was located at, Kwame?
Yes, I remember.
And you knew Dean Arnold Watson was my tax man. You know, as you see, they're both military and they were officers.
Right.
So we want to close out just to let you know about the powerful people that came from Ardmore, Oklahoma. Imagine their mother, just like Kwame's mother, ran a business, the beauty and the barber shops. Miss Martha stayed busy all the time. And when you would go by that place, she had this red sign that said Coca-Cola.
Right.
Go in there, drop your dime in that machine and get your cold Coca-Cola, Terry, while you're waiting to get your hair done. You know what I mean?
She had a lot. She had multiple streams of money because she was selling stuff as well as doing hair.
Yeah.
She sold Avon. She was a seamstress, and she was a beautician. So she had a lot of things going on.
So don't tell me Black people can't do nothing in Oklahoma because we seen it.
That's right.
Martin May Tubby, you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, yes. I'm just listening tonight and learning more and more. But
Oh, don't get
you
me
asked-
started on
you
those
did
main
ask-
tubbies
yeah,
now.
You asked something about if there was water around Douglas, and I've just mentioned this right quick. We'll move on. There, within and on a 6-block area, there were 2 judges, 3 lawyers, probably about 15 veterans, a professional boxer,
Armstrong,
2 female PhDs. I'm not gonna call names. I'm not 2 female PhDs, a couple of people that owned businesses, I mean, restaurants, things like that. And I'm talking about between I would say the 60s and 80s. Also, I forgot to mention a professional football player and whatever. This is just in a 6-block area around Ardmore, Douglas. And not to mention, I'm just talking about the Northeast. And of course, it would be for others to talk about the rest of the community.
hey, you had
So,
Mr.
yeah, Ardmore is very special.
Mr. Raymond had his barbecue over there, right over there where Miss Mary Douglas had her barbecue sandwiches and everything. And then Coach Luster lived right around the corner from there.
Yeah.
So there were businesses all over. People knew how to survive and make it happen. Kwame,
Yeah.
you remember that stuff.
Not only survive, but thrive.
Yes.
But
Dorscine, we got to hear
Cedric,
from you. We got
Cedric,
what did you say?
Cedric, before you go, you talk about survival. You need to do a show with Kwame because this brother is teaching people how to survive. Okay, and if one thing that he can show us to do is how to survive by growing our own food. You have all those empty lots all over East Side that could be a community garden. He's the man to show you how to do it.
They
You
have
need to speak with him.
Carl, I'm trying to remember his name. Joe Robinson's family had a garden right over there off of that street right there.
Well, we need more of them.
Yes, during that time period. But Dorscine, we got to hear from you because you spoke in Midwest City. You and Greg Turner, you get the closing comments as we go.
Yeah, I talked about the differences between attending an all-Black school and then having to go to an integrated school, and it was like 180-degree difference, and so I treasure the experience that I had the first several years of my life of being, because that made a difference in my life, because the teachers that taught me when I was in the 1st and 2nd grade were the ones that provided the guidance to me, and why I went into, well, I was going to go to college anyway because of my parents, but my 1st grade teacher sent off of the ACT score for me to take the test, mailed it for me, and then arranged for me to ride on the bus with Ardmore Douglas kids to Murray State College to take the ACT test. The white teachers never even thought, they were shocked when they received my ACT scores back at my high school. Yeah, HBCUs rock. But anyway, I thought I was a little nervous about our meeting initially because I thought we were way off topic, but I think we have learned some valuable things tonight. So what is it when 2 or more gather together, that something happens, there's an explosion of knowledge.
Yes.
And so I am enjoying these meetings immensely.
We're going to meet again on next week. That's all I can say. And shout out to Mr. Staub and Aaron, who did a phenomenal job being our speaker at the HFV Wilson Community Center. He reflected on Mintha, John Thompson, of course, May Zola, and many other people. He talked about his grandmother, Hermarine Hayes, and the dedication. He says that it came up for him to go to Washington, D.C. on a trip. And when she found out, she said, you will be going and your trip will be paid for. That's what we gotta have. We gotta have people that's gonna step up and get back on top of it. So, hey, I don't know what the topic is gonna be for next week. All I can tell you is just share it. Thank you so much. And we appreciate everybody being on board with us. I am Cedric Bailey. I want to say thank you to this entire panel for what you're doing. God bless everyone.
Thank you.